this chapter that we read was about like how our first impressions or like our first thoughts of something can be like, deceiving. So it started with like talking about Kenna's music and how like when people heard like snippets of the music or like when the experts heard him, like they were like, oh, he's like gonna go so far, like he's gonna have like a great career. And then when they tested it with people and they listened to the whole song and stuff, they didn't really like it. And so that's like has to do with, they talked a lot about how experts like can tell better than like normal people can, just because that's like what they've studied and that's how they like, that's their career, is like studying that one thing. So like they talked about like food testing and people like testing jams and how experts ranked them like 1 through 5, and like they had them like 1 through 5, and then they had other people test them, and it was, then they went off their first impressions. They got it like, they had a fairly high correlation to what the experts put, but then when they asked to explain it, they like swapped them all around, and they had a really low like correlation with how the experts, and that's because like how experts have trained to like, they know how to describe what they're like tasting or what they're like feeling. And they talked about the Pepsi test too. So like, how on a sip test, like Pepsi was beating over Coke, but when they, like the sales on like Coke was still better than Pepsi, just because like when you drink a whole bottle, they don't want like the sweetness of the Pepsi, but they want like the, I don't know, just like canned Coke. So that's basically the chapter.
Yeah. And something I'd like to add to that just a little bit is that when the public like test groups rated it poorly, it wasn't a reflection of how like the general market treated it. It was just the only group that didn't like it was the public test group that weren't professionals.
Yeah.
Yeah, which religion?
Yeah.
Okay, I just died, sorry. So for challenge 3, I had the author's biography and social background. I used the article from famous authors, and just talks about how Lionel was born in Hampshire, England, on September 3rd, 1963. His parents were Grandma Joyce Stabell. His mom was half Jamaican, and she was a psychotherapist, and his dad was a mathematics teacher at that university. And it kind of just talks about how, like, because of both of his parents, like, having such high educations and, like, understanding so much, that he kind of had, like, an early love for reading and just learning. And I think that really, like, plays into the book, just because it talks a lot about, like, psychology and just, like, our unconscious minds, and I think that he, like, had this first, like, was interested in that probably just because of how he was raised. In 1982, he was an intern at the National Journalism Center before he moved to the New Yorker. And he worked for like lots of journaling companies like throughout his life, and I think that this helped him like learn how to like analyze information really well, because we kind of talked about how he had to like analyze situations and things for the articles he was writing so that people could stay interested. And his first piece of journalism that he wrote was about fashion, and he says this was his inspiration for his first book, The Tipping Point, which he wrote in 2000. And yeah, I think that just mostly his background and like having his mom, that she's from Jamaica. I think that in his book he talks a lot about like race and how it like affects the world around them, and just like people's sisters, and so I think that plays like a big part into his book.
Okay, so I chose, I was doing like the social struggles in the world, and so he wrote this book around like 2004, 2005. So I used it was a website from the Pew Research Center, and it just shared a lot of about a lot of events that were going on in that time, and like how it was affecting the people. And so in the book it talks about like decision making and the decisions that we have to make. And so like in 2004 there was like a tightening of immigration laws, and I think that it like brought up the decision of like who should be let into our country and who should who can't, and I think that was like a big decision for people in this time. And it also brought up like the issue of race, which Haley talked about, like how sometimes our unconscious biases like come into play with race that we don't even like recognize. So I think that could have something to do with it. And then it also talked about in the website they had to decide if they were doing lots on deciding if like we should test human embryos for like cures for diseases and stuff. And I think that's like another like decision of like what's morally right and what's like what's wrong. So I think that like lots of these like events that were taking place like forced lots of people to choose. They were like big decisions on like who should be let in the country, who should be kept out, stuff like that. And I think that Malcolm Gladwell could have like recognized that some of these events needed like big decisions. Like they had lots of issues, and like the decisions that they needed made were big. So I think that could have influenced him in writing a book about decision making, to maybe like educate the public on how they can better make decisions and what decisions they should trust.
Yeah, I liked what like you said, because mine is like ideas around that time, like 2004, 2005, that were like circulating, and a lot's going on, especially with like the tightening of immigration laws. And one thing that I like noticed that I talked about in my article that I found was it talked about this big movement of like Hispanic and Latinos, and they were just like generally like laborers, and like it increased birth rates, and so a lot of times like created the idea or the stereotype like in many Americans' minds that like that's like they weren't like people, they were kind of just like workers, and you know like they weren't on the same level as them. And so like it's again right that like racial discrimination that you were talking about, and that they probably didn't like even consciously realize. And I think that with like Malcolm and Gladwell in the book, he does talk about that a lot, and that's something that's very prevalent during this time, especially with like the war in Iraq that's going on at this time, and like all that immigration that you're talking about. Like it's probably very much like on the forefront like of the news and the headlines, and so he probably is like relating it to himself, with himself being like half Jamaican, as well as like what's going on in the world around him. And then another thing it talked about was it did talk a lot about like people's ideas regarding like the war in Iraq, and how like they started to question like his military force or like diplomacy, like what's the best way to find peace. And it can like create some of these like contentions and like these like conflicting ideas like with each other. And he definitely like talks about like what's the best way to like come about like the right decision, right? He talks about decision making a lot, like which one is the best way, and that's definitely like an idea that's discussed a lot in 2005 due to like that war that's going on, is like what's the best decision to be made here. So like I just was like that really connects to the author. And then the last thing that I found is they talk about how in 2005 everyone's like a lot of Americans are very much rooted in religion, and so a lot of the ideas and the decisions that they're making are based off of like their beliefs regarding like religion. And so he does talk about how like our environment and the things around us like influence our decision making. And so I think that was like that idea of like religion is like root like them being really rooted in religion affects their beliefs, like affects like their decision making. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that was my
Yes, to go off a little bit of what you two were saying, I had events, and so I looked. It probably would have taken him a couple years to write this book, and so this book was released in 2005, and his last book was published in 2000, and so I kind of looked like in that area, because I doubt many things happening in 2005 would have influenced kind of what the book was about. And so I went to an article from, I think, a Wisconsin university by a couple students, and they found it's basically a graph. It goes from 1994 to 2011, and it shows black events and black articles that were written in that time. They're just like things happening, and it shows that after 9/11 there was a large decrease in any of that happening, and I think it was probably because Americans were like getting more nervous around like other cultures and other races after what happened. And so that was kind of at a really low place until 2005 when Rosa Parks passed away, and President Bush dedicated a building to her and put a statue of her in the U.S. Capitol building. And that's when they really started to surge again. And I looked up a little bit about like Malcolm Gladwell, and the time when like he really started to like grow his hair out and like present himself different than what white people would have expected was in that really low point, which I think shows a lot in like in the book and how he wrote it involving like racial stereotypes and that kind of a thing, because he's still the same person, but people started treating him a little bit differently when he like started growing his hair out and it was just more curly. And so yeah.
My section was on the social commentary on the author and about the book, and I learned that it had a lot of very mixed reviews. Most of the general public's reaction was that it was oversimplified and it used too many anecdotes and didn't have a lot of like academic rigor in the book because it didn't have a lot of studies, and it hasn't so far talked about specifically how your unconscious fully works. And I think a lot of that is because I learned that this was one of the first psychology like books to come out in that time, and so it was very new, and I thought it was funny because it connects back to the book because it talks about how when there's a new thing, it gets a lot of pushback because we're not used to it. And this book was very much also a new thing. So immediately there was a lot of pushback because it was one of the first psychology books to be written, but after that it really started a big movement in learning about psychology more.
I might add though that I think that the anecdotes and just like the simplicity of this book is part of what makes it shine, because it's not like a psychology textbook, but it's like an actually engaging book. And personally for me, anecdotes help me relate the concepts into things that I can actually understand without having to spend hours and hours thinking about it.
I liked what you said about like how sometimes like it's new, it's the first one, right? Like that's kind of one of the questions I had is like, how do we like our initial judgments, like judge things when they're new, like right away? Kind of like how we judge a book by its cover. How do we know like when it's like genuine dislike, like we're genuinely, our unconscious is like, no, I don't like that, versus like, I'm just scared, like it's just new, it's just different. Like, cause we kind of have like the same reactions, right? But like, how do we like tell the difference between the two? You know what I mean?
Also, one of my questions was like, how would you change the way that you look at or like interpret the things like around you, or like what you're looking to buy?
Yeah.
And kind of just like going along with that, like we don't like new ideas and like new things and like things that we're not comfortable with. So I think just for me, I would like, as we read the book, I'm realizing that like lots of things might be better than we think. Just like we have to give them a chance and just realize that like new isn't bad.
Yeah.
Kind of with both your questions, I think one way that's going to help us like see which we don't like and which is just like a new thing, I think it's just like spending more time with that thing. Like, of course, if we only spend like a second looking at it and we're like, oh no, like you can't really decide like super fast if you spend more time with it and like try different things out. I feel like that would help us better like understand if we just don't like this thing, if we don't want to part in it, or if it's just new and we need to get used to the idea of it.
In the book, it has the section where they're talking about the fancy chair that was new and not it didn't look like anything else that other chairs had. And so people really didn't like it for a little while, and then it started getting, it says it started to attract the attention of some very cutting edge elements of the design community. It won a Design of the Decade award from the Industrial Designers Society in America. So I think sometimes, I think you just need to look at that thing for a little bit of time, and if people have started to get more used to it, then it doesn't become new and scary. But if sometimes you just still don't like it. It talks about a truck from Ford called the Edsel, and it said it was it was a flop. In the 1950s, people thought it looked funny. 2 or 3 years later, people still thought it looked bad. So I think the question is, will it stand the test of time? And that's how you know when it's
Like what
unconscious or just.
like what you and Chelsea were saying, where it's like your experience with something kind of like changes your like perspective on it, like your judgment on it. Like what you said with like with the chair, but also like what I was thinking is like their experience with Kenna and like the music people, like people that were professionals loved it, because I think it might be because they notice things that other people don't. Because like we listen to music, like it talks about like on a very shallow level, and so maybe because they have more experience, like their initial judgment is they notice things that we don't notice. Like it says in the book, it's like people who truly know music, like who run record labels, go to clubs and know business as well, and love Kenna. They hear one of his songs and you blink of that night, they think wow. But people who like just average people listen to him and they're like confused and they don't necessarily like it. It gives them like this weird feeling. And so like I agree with like what both of you are saying. That like our experiences and like our judgment, like it talks about in the book, right, affect like our decision making, and that might like affect like our initial like judgment or whatever.
I might add, you guys have probably noticed that on like TikTok and Instagram, YouTube Shorts, musicians have been like getting audiences more involved in like the writing and like performance of their songs. I think that's like artists trying to reach this concept of they can't perform like in person with every single person in their audience, and not everyone can attend a concert. But they're all of these like critics and these people that go to clubs and bars and just like places where they can hear live music go because they can actually see the artist performing their own music, and see, because it's kind of soulless when you hear music. Well, not like soulless. Music is still like a very passionate thing, but it adds a little bit more, just like yeah. I was just gonna say stuff. Depth is a much better way to put that. It adds more depth to the music, and I think that's what like these musicians are trying to do, is they're trying to like make themselves notable in their audience's mind by adding depth to their stuff. That's how trying to think of it, Brenda Lee, Rocking Around the Christmas Tree. She topped Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You because she went out and she made a lot of videos just about like her process behind it and just performances that she posted online.
That's impressive. Oh yeah. Okay. So now we have the Choose Your Own podcast segment, and this week we chose to do the illusion section. And some of the illusions that I talked about is that it references a couple TV shows. It says it has the Mary Tyler Moore Show and the All in Family show, and it used those examples to prove that our immediate reactions when it's a new thing can kind of trip us up and be like, whoa, I don't like that. And it also talked about Bill Clinton's election process and how he had something Morris help him, and they would take polls after speeches to know what parts of arguments the voters liked more, so that they could use people's unconscious decision making to decide how they should continue with the election process.
So the election thing that you were talking about, I actually wrote that down, and it's from a memo. I actually don't know how to say it, but it's a book. And it's called Behind the Oval Office, and that's where they use a sample from the book in the Blink book, and it just talks about how they did use like polls, and they tested different like ads and different parts of speeches with the public to see what would like influence their vote more and what would like convince them better. And I thought that was a cool idea, just like, I don't know, try it out.
Something interesting I see is that like earlier we were talking about how stuff gets like a lot of pushback at first, but then it's accepted. Is that both of the things you guys have brought up, the like polling people politically and the TV shows that are more like politically and like socially charged, have both become like way bigger things nowadays. Because we have like SNL, The Simpsons, like that kind of thing, which are just very much like what's going on like politically and socially in the world, and even like polling after like events and stuff, because we have like elections like before the actual election, and a lot of people like going out in the streets. I just think it's interesting how like those were in the book, they were like crazy concepts, but nowadays they're just kind of standard.
Another thing that I was like, it's like a kind of a different like illusion that I noticed, but it's under the same umbrella, is when it talked about like the two different alcohol companies that were competing, there's like Christian Brothers and E&J, and how like packaging has such like a big effect like on your mind. And like they talked about, they referred to like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and even to like just like name brands in the store where they changed it from like a can to like a glass bottle, and how your mind like just associates, like your unconscious just automatically like associates things with other things. Like it's true, like basically what he's saying is like true that like we like things that are aesthetically pleasing, and like we might not even realize like that it's affecting our decision making, but we're willing to pay like 75 cents more for the glass jar instead of the can, because to us that reminds us of like grandma's house. Or so like those illusions that they made to like helped you like relate to like how you like make, how your like unconscious is actually making like decisions for you every day. And he kind of talks about like that you don't even realize it, like you put like Coke is the #1 soft drink in the world, but in a test against Pepsi, like the sip test, like our initial judgment is like, oh, Pepsi's sweeter, but when you drink a whole can, Coke is still wins. So it's like just like how do you like
One of the questions I had was just kind of like what the main idea of like labeling, packaging and things like that were. And a quote that I found was about like the brandy, and it says, so we've been able to isolate what the Christian Brothers problem is. The problem is not the product, and it's not in the brandy, it's packaging. And I think it kind of just like shows the same idea that like our unconscious minds like things are like attractive or things that we like, and like we're just more drawn to those things. And like on the purple paper, I kind of did more like of the hidden connections instead of illusions. And it talks about Kenna, and like the song that he released was the new Sacred Cow or something. And in the book it says, it was the same old story. The equivalent of Gail Vance Simmel and Judy Haleman had loved Kenna. Craig Kalman had heard his demo tape and got on the phone and said, I want to see him now. And it's like throughout the whole book, that's kind of just like the connection that I've had with all the stories, is that like we like things that are normal and that are attractive to us. So I think that we'll be like more drawn to them, and once we realize that, then we'll be able to like look past like our minds and what they think.
So one question that I wrote down was, what are some negative outcomes that could come to pass because of the decisions we make unconsciously or like without us even knowing? And in the book, it talks about like how the packaging and everything like we've been talking about, it like affects the way we like buy, like if we buy it or not. And it says people give an assessment of something they might buy at a supermarket or department store without realizing it. They transfer sensations or impressions that they have about the packaging of the product to the product itself. and it gave the example of like the margarine and how nobody wanted to buy it. But then when they colored it yellow, it like reminded them of butter, it reminded them of like the normal. And so then they did a test of like yellow and white margarine, and everyone bought the yellow and they tasted the yellow with the butter, and everyone just thought it like all tasted the same. So I thought that was an interesting concept, how like even just like changing the look of one thing that's like the exact same, like same product, same taste, but like it makes it more familiar, more comfortable with us, and it like influences to like buy it more or something. I was like,
It's like we like are more like drawn to things that like are familiar to us. Like initially, like we're more familiar with yellow butter, and we're more familiar with like Coke because we see it everywhere. You know, like things like that.
Well, it's not, and sorry, Lily. I think it's interesting that like he could have just said product A and product B in any of these, because and butter and margarine's like a bit more specific. But he could have just said like soda A and soda B, but he specifically used Coke and Pepsi. One, because that was the actual example, but I think he wanted to draw as many connections in the reader's head as he could.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, one of my questions was, why does choosing your packaging and labeling make so much of a difference to our, like, the way we taste things? And the quote I found for it was, we're reacting not only to the evidence from our taste buds and salivary glands, but also to the evidence of our eyes and memories and imaginations. Just thought it was interesting that, like, it's so held together. But if it's actually nasty, packaging won't help. But when it's something good, we just think it cuts better when it's
It'll amplify the effect of the product.
good job, guys.